Hi, this is Kim Eierman from EcoBeneficial, bringing you more useful tips to help improve our environment. I am absolutely delighted to have a special guest today, Nancy Lawson. Now, Nancy is an author, educator, and garden habitat consultant, and she is the author of this wonderful book called The Humane Gardener, Nurturing a Backyard Habitat for Wildlife. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, I love your book. There's a lot of really terrific insight in it about how we can look at our gardens a little bit differently. So your message is no matter where we live or the size of our landscape or the type of landscape that we have, we can actually embrace wildlife, so to speak, by having a little bit different perspective. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, exactly. And by thinking from their perspective, so how would they look at what's in our landscapes? How would they look at the plants? How would they be able to live among the cultivation practices that we currently have?
So there's no avoiding the topic of deer, the creature we used to celebrate and still do in parts of the country. I've been out to the Smoky Mountains where people get out of their cars, in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. They get out of their cars to go look at deer. These people obviously are living somewhere else
Yes.
than where I live. But could you tell us, what are some tips that you have about dealing with deer, coexisting with deer, how deer are using our landscapes, those kinds of things?
Yeah. So the first thing that people try to do is resistance. And while I think it's helpful to know what types of species deer may not be as attracted to, it isn't ultimately going to work as a single solution if you're worried about deer eating your plants, and it's going to end up frustrating you because they're individuals and their tastes change depending on what else is in the environment. And so I advocate for actually trying to plant for deer as well, or let little areas grow up that they'll actually be able to eat and then take the pressure off some of the more cultivated areas.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, perhaps not as doable in a single yard in an urban area if you've got a small space, but it could be if you're connected to parks, if you approach it as a community-wide sort of strategy. And here, where I am in Central Maryland, we do have, I would say the majority of people still have mowed lawns and just a few trees and just a few flowers. But in the places where people have started to add a lot more vegetation, there is some pressure that's taken off of the garden plants. And so one example here is that we have allowed our sassafras trees, which volunteered in our yard, to just sort of make little groves in different areas. And we've done the same thing with the staghorn sumacs. And the deer really enjoy eating those in the winter. They'll eat some leaves in the summer, but they eat the bark and the twigs in the winter. And these are fairly dense patches. So there might be 100 sassafras trees in a little, maybe 15 by 15-foot space. And it doesn't really matter to me if they get tall, although some do. So I end up having some more trees. But it has the effect of giving them something to eat that I know they're going to eat. And it's kind of like hunters making food plots to
Mm-hmm.
attract deer, except you're doing it to just help them have something to eat
Mm-hmm.
and to help coexist with them as a gardener.
I think
Um,
something that people fail to appreciate is that if deer are desperate enough, they will eat just about everything. So, up in
yeah,
my parts, boxwood is like the go-to plant, oversold like crazy as a deer-proof plant. And I've seen deer browse on boxwood. If they're starving, they can't eat the vast majority of invasive plants that are inhabiting our natural areas. So they eat what's
right.
available.
Right. I mean, they'll even eat yuccas, which you wouldn't think that that would be
Mm,
very tasty to them. But in the winter, they'll eat our yuccas. And So, and when they are eating something that's just irresistible, some things that I do, like my Joe Pye weeds when they're small, I'll put rose trimmings around them, or I'll also let grasses grow up around them for a while until they get tall enough. And
Mm-hmm.
it's just a visual deterrent and it's a tactile deterrent, and it's the idea of making a path of least resistance, because I mean they're like us, they'll go for stuff that's easy and accessible. And I find that's one of my favorite things. That's also using plants as a deterrent, but it's just, debris from not dead plants, but trimmings and things like that.
Mm-hmm. So instead of using all quote unquote deer resistant plants, and that list is a moving target,
Yeah.
which inherently limits biodiversity, we can start to think about managing our tasty plants a little bit better, right? And
Right.
one strategy that I use is protecting tasty plants, especially woody plants, until they get of sufficient size when they can tolerate some deer browse.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. I do that too. And also, I just sort of came across this idea just by accident when I started noticing all the plants mixing together in one of my little meadow gardens that I made.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then I saw in Larry Weiner's book, Garden Revolution, he does that as an intentional strategy where he'll put things they don't like to eat as much, even in the same hole as the
Right.
asters. And yeah, so
And that's a great tip. Creating a meadow or a meadowscape, a smaller meadow type garden, makes less of a deer target because we have so many different plants that are intermixed. So it's difficult for deer to only eat this wonderful buffet that we typically plant for them.
right.
So I think that's a great tip.
Yeah, yeah, that and yeah, the idea of just kind of watching and not freaking out as soon as you see, oh my gosh, they ate this, they're going to eat everything,
Hmm.
because it's just not always the case.
And what are your thoughts about management of deer, culling?
I don't agree with it because there's a long history of managing a lot of different wildlife, quote unquote, and and managing them to the point of practically having a point of extinction. And so we've done it with deer, we've done it with geese, wolves, where there's open season on them for a while, and then we decide we need to bring them back. And with deer, they were relocated to so many different parts of the country so that they could be repopulated um, and have a healthy population that could be hunted again. And I feel like we get into these cycles um, of there's too many of this species. There's not enough of that species, and without really looking at what we can do and what we have done to cause this problem. And so for deer in particular, sometimes there are the broader ecological issues that people talk about with deer in the woods, and they're eating all the native plants. And while that may be true, it doesn't always apply to what's happening in our gardens. First of all, there are hardly any native plants in most gardens still. And so, what can we do to bring that back and fix that first?
Hmm.
And we're not, I'm not a native forest, although I'm trying to sort of recreate one. So, why would I come here to my 2 acres that was initially turf grass and get mad at the first deer that eats a tulip or something like that,
Hmm.
instead of actually trying to replant this land and put back what humans have taken away?
Hmm. And this strategy of target plants for deer, I think, is a really good one. Things that rebound quickly from deer
Hmm.
browse. I mean, I really like things like cutleaf coneflower and jillweed as
Hmm.
examples. Things, particularly things that reseed prolifically, and kind of letting that happen. And I think folks haven't really explored these strategies enough to pass judgment on whether they do or don't work. So I encourage listeners to get out there and think about, distraction plants for your deer.
I totally agree. That's such a good point. Like plants like jewelweed and elderberry is another one that it grows so prolifically it can withstand that nibbling once you
Mm-hmm.
get it going. Like you said, sometimes you have to protect it at first, but once it's of any size, sometimes they even like to be pruned a little bit. They'll just get more vigorous and keep
Mm-hmm.
sending
Mm-hmm.
up new shoots. So
And so we've talked a lot about deer, and it is it's a source of frustration for gardeners. So I encourage folks to read your book and come up with some new ideas about this. But there are other creatures that we malign. One in particular, I'm a big fan of. I know you are too, and that is squirrels.
yay, squirrels.
So tell us why squirrels are important and why we should give squirrels a little bit more love.
Yeah, well, squirrels are forest regenerators. So there's this big movement in gardening to plant oak trees, right? Because they have so many caterpillars. They support so many caterpillars that baby birds can eat, and squirrels plant lots of oak trees, lots of walnuts, and they do so by storing their food for the winter, and some of that food ends up sprouting, and so. That's one reason that they're important, and that's a sort of reason that they're important to other animals and to us. But I also just treasure them as individual, interesting, really dynamic little beings because they are almost like little monkeys if you squirrel watch.
They're characters, aren't they?
They're characters, and they have these really interesting strategies for hiding their food, the deceptive caching that they do, or they pretend to hide their acorns in certain places, but they're really not doing it because they don't want another squirrel to see or us to see or a blue jay to see, and they create nests for even for bumblebees. Sometimes their abandoned nests are used by bumblebees, so that's another interesting aspect of how they help the rest of the ecosystem. And I think a lot of gardeners get upset with them because they do a little bit of digging here. We really just don't even notice stuff like that because there's so many plants now. But another reason is that people get upset with them because they eat from bird feeders. But if that's going to bother you, if you can find a baffle or something, that's fine. But also, then focus more on planting plants for all the animals because I see squirrels in the winter eating seeds from our garden. More than I see. We put up feeders like during snowstorms. Normally I don't because I just want to focus more of my money and time on the plants that animals can eat. But when there's deep snow, I put up some feeders sometimes. And the squirrels actually sometimes prefer to go to the garden where there's wild bergamot seeds. They'll bend them down and eat them, and echinacea seeds and things like that. And so if you can focus more on true habitat rather than artificial stuff, you might be able to forge more of a relationship.
That speaks to a gardening practice of leaving our perennials and our native grasses standing through winter as a seed source and habitat. So talk a little bit about that if you would.
Yeah. So we don't take most stuff down unless it's falling over in the path for the winter. Both for the seeds for the birds and the squirrels and others, but also for those bees. I cut some of them so that bees can access them, and then I leave them up through the seasons. That whole strategy of leaving them so that in the spring a mason bee or another type of cavity nesting bee can come in there and use those perennial stalks and then lay their eggs, and then you have to leave them up through the next season for them to be able to actually hatch and come out. So we do that in a lot of areas, and I talk to people about if even if they're in a visible space, there's the research that's been done by Heather Holm and others on having a 12 to 15 inch perennial stock up is not going to be is going to actually help some of those bees, but it's not going to be so intrusive that it's going to upset your neighbors. You know, the plants will grow up around it. It's not that tall. So you can aesthetically do some of these things in a way that is also beneficial to wildlife. And there's some of the leading up to some of the stalks just for the seed heads is actually really beautiful. It's just I think people aren't used to that, aren't used to what that looks like and why it's there, and talking to them about it.
And let's give a shout out for signage. Getting some signage in our landscapes. Choice is yours, whether it's National Wildlife Federation or Xerces. But I think signage can really give the clue to neighbors and friends that we're doing something differently on purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have I have what I call, if you've ever seen the movie Office Space, there's a character in there who's a waitress, and she has to wear those suspenders with all those buttons on them, all those cheesy. And she calls them her 37 pieces of flair. So I have my 37 pieces of flair on my signage because I have a bat conservation sign. I have Xerces Society. I have Humane Backyard for HSUS, and I've got Monarch Waste Station. I'm about to add a non-pesticide one, but my father made a totem pole with a little carving of cardinal at the top so that they're all sort of neatly placed.
So you have a lot of signs, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I have a lot of signs. And although I have a close relative there who doesn't want me to identify her until her legal situation is over with, she's getting sued by her HOA and
Homeowners Association.
She tried by her homeowners association, and she tried signage, and she's not even allowed to have a sign to explain what she's doing. And so, you know, there's those other sort of cues to care that you can do, which are more and more important these days because of all the land that's owned by homeowners associations and controlled by it.
And, you know, for those of us who are in the business or are really passionate about native plants, educating your neighbors, inviting them to your garden for a reception. I had clients of mine who just did this past weekend to kind of explain what we're doing and why we're doing it, and give them a free plant
Yes,
when
so
they
I
leave.
I love that idea so much, and I'd love to get more tips from you about that because I've been thinking about doing that in my own neighborhood. And my neighbors, they're all great. We don't get complaints, but I want people to start doing this even a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
and we only have a few folks who do. And I think that's such a good idea because it's really that human to human connection that's going to make all the difference. I mean, we care about the animals and the plants, but we also have to care about the people.
Well, what you talk about in your book, I mean, this stuff just isn't taught in schools, right? So, and Richard Louv has written a wonderful book, Last Child in the Woods, talking about the nature disaffect syndrome with kids. I think it's bigger than that. I think it's a nature disaffect syndrome with adults as well. So getting people connected to their landscapes and understanding that this may be the only little remnant of nature left for the creatures that we share the planet with.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, last year I had this bone set, the tall bone set in the front, and it was growing almost out of a crack in our driveway. And our neighbors came by, and they were pretty excited about it because there were all these butterflies on it.
Mm-hmm.
And then they saw things like the furry little flies that try to look like bees. They're bee mimics. She said, "Oh, I don't want that one. That one's," you know, but over time, as she kept looking, she started to have more of an appreciation, I think, because this animal was with all the other ones that were more aesthetically pleasing to her. And yeah, I think they're not used to seeing these things up close because of the last 50 years of pesticides and manicured spaces, and it's just like you said, introducing them to the idea.
So there's been this trend really to have butterfly gardens, and we call them pollinator gardens. There are a lot of different kinds of pollinators, but of course people are thinking of bees. We can't bring ourselves to use that word bee. But I think, what I tell people is if you're planting like this, you're going to attract a lot more than the target creatures, right? And that's a good thing because we live in these big food webs. So
Right.
getting people exposed to a lot of the different creatures and their attributes, I think is wonderful. And you do it so well in your book. So let me go back to squirrels. What are some of the things that we can do, additional things, strategies to help squirrels be healthier? Because obviously, you don't want the mangy, sad, skinny little squirrels that look terribly unhealthy, who are have a subsistence diet of peanuts and sunflower seeds that you're throwing out, which aren't particularly good for them. So what can we do to help squirrels be healthier and, you know, enjoyable in our gardens?
Well, I think a lot of the same plants that we're planting for birds, a lot of the trees and the shrubs and the wildflowers are things that provide seeds and berries for squirrels. And so we tend to think of them as hoarding the nuts for and digging and planting them for the winter. But when it's around February is when really a lot of these food sources are depleting, and there isn't much left in the landscape and they're doing their mating then, starting their nesting, and they look pretty bad by then, some of them. And so trying to have these, they'll eat those really early maple seeds,
Mm-hmm.
and these plants that start providing early in the season, or the late winter emergency food source type plants like winter berries and things,
Mm-hmm.
are really important to the wildlife, that they might start trying to eat more from your feeders then too, and just being a little bit more accepting of them doing that, and understanding that it's the most difficult time of the year for them.
And I will admit, listeners, that I actually do throw out some shelled nuts for squirrels in the winter because I know that they don't get the right nutrition from sunflower seed and from peanuts. So,
Yeah.
as a supplemental thing in the winter. But also, one notion that I've shared with clients is planting some trees or shrubby plants like shrubby oaks that produce produce some sort of nut or fruit or seed early in its life cycle, because a lot of our oaks take a very, very long time
Yeah.
to produce mast. So, like the dwarf chinkapin oak is one that produces acorns really early, in like 3 to 5 years.
Okay. Uh-huh.
So that's also something we can do. But
Yeah.
I would really bemoan a garden without wildlife. It wouldn't be a garden to me.
I agree. I mean, that's what brings it to life. And actually, the first few years that we were here, I was starting to plant wildflowers, but I was doing mostly annuals, and I was trying to plant perennials. I was doing a few natives, but didn't really know a ton about that yet. But what I wasn't doing was those bushes and trees and that middle shrubby layer.
Mm-hmm.
And gosh, there weren't very many animals at all for at least half the year,
Mm-hmm.
and I felt really lonely.
Yeah. Yeah. And even kind of getting excited by seeing another animal that people love to hate, groundhogs. So
Yes.
I'm bringing up all the toxic stuff here, but let's get it out in the open. Well, tell us why groundhogs are important, why we should give them more respect.
Yeah, well, groundhogs are also habitat creators, and so their burrows are become home to a lot of different creatures who need shelter. They are little amphibians and skunks and foxes, raccoons, reptiles, and they aerate the soil. And so that ends up nurturing more plants for wildlife, hopefully. And they actually will eat a lot of little forbs if you leave them. So
These
I
are
have,
flowering native perennials.
yeah, and
Hmm.
or even the dandelions and the clovers. But yeah, the
Right.
native example that I like to use is fleabane. They love it, and I have a friend with a prolific vegetable garden, in the next county over, and every day he has groundhog visitor in the summer, and he has all this video. I used some of it in my presentation of this groundhog eating the flea veins, and it's right next to the tomatoes and the peppers and the lettuce, and so again, that's like a plant that you can, if you leave it, most people pull it and think of it as weedy, but if you leave it and you let it start to spread, it really starts to blend in with a nice native garden. And it can take the pressure off a little bit of those other plants that the groundhog likes. And I also, some of these plants that I mentioned that I leave out for deer, the groundhogs will nibble on those too, some of the
Hmm.
suckering trees and such.
And fleabane, I find it really cute, and I actually plant it intentionally, but also beneficial to some of our bees.
Uh-huh.
Right? So let the fleabane do its thing. It
Yeah.
doesn't help that some of these native plants have names like fleabane
I
or Joe Pye
know.
weed. You know, so
I
we
know.
need some renaming.
Exactly.
You know, I don't know if you've read Michael Pollan's book Second Nature, which came out in the
Yes.
90s, and he has this horrific chapter about how he was trying to eradicate groundhogs, which I probably shouldn't repeat in the
It's so
podcast.
upsetting. I
It's
know.
pretty horrible, but he kind of learned his lesson. So, pick up that book and take a read. It predated our conversion.
Yeah, oh, did it? Yeah. And I had this wonderful experience when my dog died, who used to be my fellow gardener out there, and she would dig a hole behind the ostrich ferns in the summer to lie in, and I was really upset to be out there very much in the year after she died. Like I kind of lost my jonesing for gardening, I guess you would say, and then that fall or early winter we saw a little guy, a little groundhog, right out there outside our back door. And I realized that he had made a big place behind the fern where she used to lie down in the summer. So it was like she had created this little area for him that he then, I don't know, it just made me feel like the animals were helping each other, and it made me feel better about my dog,
hmm
lasting in the landscape somehow.
No, I think that's great. And shall I dare ask about wasps? Very misunderstood creatures.
Yes. Oh my gosh. So yeah, they truly are, and I try to learn what I can about the wasps in our landscape here. And so there's a few that I think are particularly misunderstood or feared, and one of them is the bald-faced hornet. And we had and that's one of the more social ones. And so people see that big papery nest going up, and they think I got to get rid of it. But we had one right by our patio for a summer a few years ago, and they we saw them in the garden a lot. They were collecting caterpillars for their young, and they were in the flowers, but they never bothered us until I went too close with my phone to the entry hole to try to take a picture, and they came after me, and I got away. But I really liken it to the idea of someone coming to your window or your door like a peeping tom and trying to get near your family. You're going to protect your family too that way. Otherwise they were not coming near me, and we just appreciated them, and we had dinner there every night and everything. And then in the winter we left that nest up, and birds start to peck at it and get whatever's left in there, and then they use some of that for their nesting material. And then a lot of these wasps are solitary, like
Mm-hmm.
the
The majority.
yeah, yeah. So the mud dauber wasp, the one that makes little organ pipes under decks, and people will take those away. But they're just stuffing spiders in there for their young, and they're not even going to go after you, even when you get near their nest, and because they're solitary. And I love in Heather Holmes' most recent book, she wrote about the fact that a lot of native bees will reuse those abandoned mud dauber wasp nests. And so that's pretty neat. That's
Mm-hmm.
another wasp being a habitat creator.
And wasps are terrific beneficial predators of other insects too.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you have a vegetable garden and you plant those flower strips around them, you'll get a lot of the parasitoid
Mm-hmm.
wasps, and we've got lots of blue-winged wasps on our bone set in the late summer, and they lay their eggs in the Japanese beetle larvae. And I discovered a wasp during the eclipse last summer. It was just the neatest thing. I was walking out to try to see the eclipse, which we really only saw a tiny bit of here, but um, I saw this wasp with bright blue wings and a bright orange body. And I called her the eclipse wasp because when she closed her wings, she was dark as twilight. And then when she opened them, it was like she was revealing the sun. And it was the neatest experience because I learned a new, and the species was Trogus penator. And she actually lays her eggs in swallowtail butterfly caterpillars, which, you know, a lot of people wouldn't like because they want to keep their butterflies. But to me, it was an indication that we have a lot of um, swallowtail
Mm-hmm.
butterflies.
Mm-hmm. And everything's interconnected in some way, shape, or form, which sometimes we fail to remember.
Right.
Um, well, thank you for that, and share with our listeners in closing some do's and don'ts for their own landscapes that help wildlife that make our gardens more special.
Yeah. So one of the easiest things to do is to stop bringing so many inputs in, like mulch, and start letting the leaves fall where they may, or put them under the shrubs and the trees and around your flowers. And then they'll provide overwintering spots for bumblebees, and they'll provide lots of area eventually for birds to forage in the winter, all those little seeds and insects that collect in there. And and then leaving up some of the stalks like we talked about, and reducing your lawn area. One thing that we haven't talked about yet here is the fact that mowers are so detrimental to frogs and turtles and some of these little creatures that you may not even know are there and that might be a little bit too slow to get out of the way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, you don't have to do it all at once, but just trying to create new areas a bit at a time, and trying to look at what's been lost and how you can bring it back through more vegetation. I think the answer is the answer to all of these things, whether it's conflict or invitation, conflict resolution or invitation of wildlife, is to plant more plants and plant more native plants.
Mm-hmm. Yep, less lawn.
Yeah.
And the layers that you mentioned, which I think is really critical, regardless of where you live, there are always some sort of layers, even if they're very indistinct.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy. I love your book. I hope listeners will read your book. Again, The Humane Gardener, Nurturing a Backyard Habitat for Wildlife. And please go to Nancy's website, humanegardener.com, and read her wonderful writing about these concepts. And I hope you will join me again, Nancy. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Kim.